Hansjörg Schmidt ist Lichtplaner und unterrichtet am Rose Bruford College in London, wo er den Master Light and Performance leitet und deshalb dann auch der Vortrag auf Englisch. Hansjörg spricht aber perfekt Deutsch, ist Deutscher und wir haben dadurch die Chance, im Anschluss auch Fragen auf Deutsch zu stellen. Sicherlich auch auf Englisch. Und auch das ist natürlich toll, wenn sich da jemand traut. Ich glaube, viel mehr sage ich gar nicht mehr, Hansjörg. Ich freue mich wahnsinnig.
Prima, vielen Dank, Cornelia. Hallo, guten Abend. Ich fange auf Deutsch an und dann wechsle ich in Englisch. Oder wechsle auf das Englische. Und ich mache das nicht um euer Leben schwer zu machen, sondern weil ich lebe seit 25 Jahren jetzt in England. Und dann das Fachvokabular über Beleuchtung habe ich alles auf Englisch gelernt. Und deswegen ist es einfach für mich einfacher, auf Englisch über Licht zu reden, obwohl ich bin ein Schwabe, ich komme aus der Nähe von Stuttgart. Und, ähm, und es amüsiert immer Kollegen, also wenn ich ab und zu was in Deutschland einleuchte, dann finden das die Techniker ganz witzig, dass ich die deutschen Fachbegriffe nicht weiß von den verschiedenen Beleuchtungskörpern und Pulten und dann eben das auf Englisch sagen muss. Und die fragen auch, du bist doch Deutscher, du bist ja ein Schwabe. Also es ist nur deswegen geht es nachher gleich auf Englisch weiter. Wie die Cornelia gesagt hat, ich unterrichte am Rose Bruford College in London. Das ist auf Englisch heißt es ein Conservatoire. Und das heißt, dass dadurch durch Praxis unterrichtet wird. Also man lernt Licht, wie man ein Klavier zu spielen lernt. Also nur über Üben, nur über das praktische Üben. Und das College hat also mehrere Theater auf dem Campus und ich leite den MA in Light and Performance. Und das ist ein Jahr, 13 Monate Kurs, der am Rose Bruford College und in Lewisham, was ein bisschen näher am Zentrum von London dran ist. Also auch von den beiden, der streckt sich über 2 Campus. Und ich bin selbst ich war für lange Zeit freiberuflicher Lighting Designer, bevor ich ans Rose Bruford College bin. Also ich habe einen Abschluss vom Goldsmiths College in London und habe dann für die ersten 15 Jahre einfach freiberuflich als Lighting Designer gearbeitet, bevor ich dann ans Rose Bruford College bin. Leuchte aber weiterhin so 2 oder 3 Stücke pro Jahr leuchte ich auch weiterhin noch ein. Ist mir auch sehr wichtig, dass ich also weiterhin praktisch als Lighting Designer arbeiten kann und nebendran natürlich den Kurs leite. Aber also nur ein Kurs leiten ohne die praktische Erfahrung für mich irgendwie passt nicht. Also deswegen, und ich wollte euch ein paar Beispiele geben jetzt heute von ein paar Produktionen, die ich über die letzten paar Jahre angeleuchtet habe. Okay, und jetzt geht es auf Englisch weiter und ich mache den Screenshare. Auch noch zu sagen, wenn es irgendein technisches Problem gibt oder so, wenn ihr was nicht sehen könnt oder was nicht versteht, dann sagt einfach. Ne? Also könnt ihr euch ganz einfach nur Stopp sagen oder so und dann kann ich was antworten. Aber ansonsten wartet ihr vielleicht mit den Fragen bis ans Ende. Okay, so this talk is called A Language of Light, and it's really important to me that we think about light as something that's trying to say something, that's trying to communicate something. So light isn't just decorative, like it often is. If you're going to, and I think that's the same whether you're lighting a building or a musical in the West End. Often lighting is seen as purely decorative. And what that means is that it's used to make things look pretty. There's no other meaning than, a single statement about an emotion, a color, the architecture of a building. And that's quite boring, I think. And so I'm really keen to think about light as something that's like a language. So there's nuance, there is a grammar, that we need to think about, what makes, if we put different lighting instruments together, or if we do a series of cues, And I don't know how much you know about theatre lighting, but in theatre lighting, we use something that's called a cue, and each cue is a single image. So a show, a piece of performance, like a theatre show or a rock and roll show, is made out of a series of cues, so a series of images that change, over time. So the cues are the syntax and the grammar of light. So we need to think about, in what order do we present something? In what order do we reveal something? Do we reveal, a detail to start with and then move on to the bigger frame? Or do we start with the big frame and then become smaller and smaller and smaller? So that's the grammar of light, thinking about cues. And the semantics of light is, the lights. So each light I choose, whether I want to use a spotlight or a beam light or a wash light, I need to think about what that means. There's a different quality to each different lighting instrument, and I'll show you some examples of this as part of this talk. So it's also important to think about the semantics of light. What's the meaning of all of this? And that includes, if I switch a light on, so the default position, I think, of a lighting designer in performance, in theater or rock and roll, is blackness. So that's what we said. The canvas to start with is there's nothing, it's black. So each light that is being introduced, there needs to be a reason for why it's there. Why do I add that light? Why do I decide to light an actor or a musician or a particular bit of the scenery? So that's the semantics. And if you can't say why you're using a particular light, then you're not creating a language. You're doing something that's just decorative. So where does that all come from? That idea of a language of light. So it comes, amongst many other things, from painting. So painters like Vermeer and many others are lighting designers. They're thinking very carefully about how an image, how do they want to light a particular image. And here's an example of that. So, so Vermeer has quite carefully thought about, where the light source is. So the window, is the window is the window visible or not? So, and he's decided that the window is visible. So there's meaning to that. He's thought about where to place the light source, and making the light source visible as part of the frame is invested in meaning. So what he wants us to think about is the presence of day, and the fact that woman is inside, so she's separated from the daylight, but the daylight is allowed in. So, so there's a connection between her and the world outside. But the wall is blocking it. So there is an idea of yearning and of the woman, sort of feeling the pull of something else. And that might be what's in that letter, so, what is she reading? And Vermeer is trying to give us clues with the lighting about what it says in that letter. So there's a language emerging, that uses light and props and performance to create a particular narrative, to create a particular story. What we don't have yet in painting is syntax. So there's no movement through time. So this is a still image. So all the meaning is contained within a single image. So there's semantics, but there's no syntax yet. This is a photograph by a photographer based in London called Tom Hunter, and he's really brilliant. And he did a series of photographs that were based on sort of classical paintings. So this is his version of the Vermeer painting that we've just seen. And he's called the series of photographs Living in Hell, which was a headline in the Hackney Gazette. So Hackney is a part of, it's one of the London boroughs, and Tom lives there. He lives in Hackney, and And the Hackney Gazette sort of had a series of articles about living in Hackney, and they called it living in hell, which is not what, I mean, particularly now Hackney is really gentrified and it's, it's a really hip part of London. But sort of Hunter maybe did those photographs about 20 years ago, and probably back then it was still quite a deprived area of London. And this photograph is called Woman Reading a Repossession Order. So he's, and what's interesting about this, so as you can see, it copies the composition of the Vermeer painting, with the woman standing by the window and reading a piece of paper. What Hunter's doing, what's quite interesting, is he's investing additional meaning into this. So the beautiful thing about Vermeer is that the meaning is completely left to us watching or looking at that painting. We can try and work out what it says in that letter. He doesn't give us any clues. Vermeer doesn't give us any clues about the meaning of that. So it's very subtle. Whilst Hunter, is pretty specific about what, it's in the title. So a repossession order is, what that means is that the council has written to that woman saying that they're gonna take her flat away from her, and obviously she's, she has a baby. So there is a social context to this photograph that's absent in the Vermeer. But what's interesting is that the quality of the light is the same. So Vermeer is not changing the language of the light. He's just changing the context of how much he decides to tell us about what's going on in that painting. And I think that's really important, because what's most important if you work in theatre and performance is that you've got to acknowledge that there's an audience. There's people coming to see what you've done. And you need to have a dialogue, a conversation with that audience. If you pretend that they're not there, then I think theatre becomes quite dysfunctional quite quickly. And in German theatre, one of the reasons why I'm still in England is that I think German theatre quite often forgets that there's an audience. And I think the reason for that is because it's partly because German theatre is subsidized really, really well. So compared to England, the German theatres don't really have to worry that much about how many tickets they sell on the box office, because they have state subsidies, so they get money from government, to run the theatre. And that's not the case in England. So in England, even the biggest, the National Theatre, the biggest theatre in the country, has to, about 40% of their income come from ticket sales. So if no one comes to see their work, that's a big, big problem. And because of that, theatre in England and the training of theatre in England constantly refers back to, but what is the audience going to make of this? And that's quite a crucial shift. And I think my idea of light is always governed about, is what I'm doing clear to the audience watching? Do they understand the language of the light? And Hunter, is starting to do that by other means. He doesn't trust the light. He's adding words to explain that context. The other thing I'm quite interested in about light is, and this is Friedrich sort of makes a similar point about, sort of like the role of the audience or the spectator. And Friedrich, sort of like all the figures in Friedrich's paintings, die Rückenfiguren, they've all got their backs turned to us looking into the painting. And Friedrich, I think, has done that because he doesn't want us to interpret what the person in the painting is feeling. And I think that's really key. He wants there to be a direct relationship between the person looking at the painting and the sky, particularly, and the light in Friedrich's case. And I think that's fascinating. And I think that is something that I'm trying to do as lighting designer. I'm trying to go beyond the performers. I don't necessarily want the audience to read the story of the play through the face of the performer. I think it's important, that we see the actor and that we see what the actor, in their face, what their mime, that we hear their words. I think that's really, really important. But it's not everything. And that's where I differ from the English theatre tradition, because in the English theatre tradition, the most important thing is the text, is the playwright. So everything starts with that in English theatre. German directors are really brilliantly up for, ripping up the play text and doing something completely different, doing a Shakespeare which starts in the middle and finishes at the beginning. That's unimaginable in England. And my idea of a language of light is about that language can communicate directly with the audience. It's not got to be channeled through the actor or through the performer. And it's a little bit, I think, like that with architecture. I think it's important that the way you light a building needs to mean something, to the people passing through that building or occupying that building, in a direct fashion or manner that's not mediated by the architect or, by other stakeholders in that relationship, but that there is a direct relationship between the light and the people, using the light, observing it, reading the story. And Friedrich, I think, is fascinating because of that, because I think he started that idea of the light having a language in its own right. And it's also interesting to think about Friedrich, so this is John Constable, who's an English romantic painter who paints at the same time than Friedrich. So, it's early 19th century. And Constable isn't interested in a language of light, he's interested in the science of light. So he's interested, John Constable wants to be a photographer, but the technology isn't ready yet. So he doesn't think about light as something that's, living and organic and that can be shaped and changed to communicate a particular meaning. He thinks of light as sunrise. He wants to know what the wavelength of the sunlight is. He's not interested in emotions. And he paints like that. He paints like a photographer. So he captures, so the language of light in Constable is decorative. It's what, it's not meaningful in the way I like to think about light. And then syntax arrives. So the idea of then sort of connecting a series of images together to create a visual narrative starts with somebody called Edward Muybridge, who's a photographer who works in California in the sort of 1890s, and he's the first one to start taking a series of photographs, like in this picture. So in that case, a series of photographs of a horse in motion, and then of course, then he finds out quite quickly that if you put these still images in a series and run them in front of a light, and you get a moving image. So all of a sudden, we start to think about not just sort of like language of light as something that's embedded in a single frame, but something that develops over time and that has a narrative development. So here are some examples of my own work, and how I use all of this in my own practice. So this is a photograph of a theatre show called Kursk by a company called Sound and Fury. And that's quite a long. That's about 10 or 12 years ago now. And it was produced in London at the Young Vic Theatre, and it was about the Russian submarine. The play was about a Russian submarine, Kursk, which I don't know whether you remember, which sort of sank during maneuvers in the Bering Sea, just after Vladimir Putin became president. And the idea of the show was that it's called immersive theatre in English. So the idea is that the audience is part of the production. So in this case, the theatre space was turned into the inside of a submarine, and a British submarine that's spying on the Kursk, on the Russian submarine. So we can hear what happens to the Kursk through what the British sailors can hear through the sonar beam. And the show was lit without theatre lighting instruments. and that was really interesting. So we didn't use a single theater light for that show. It was all lit with architectural light fittings, so the sort of things that you might be using. And the reason for that was because when we made the show, we thought quite a lot about how can we get to a point that the audience, the people watching, are believing that they're inside a submarine. So they're not seeing themselves as sitting in a theater watching something, but that they are on board this submarine, they're part of the story. So the set consists of a series of small sort of islands that, as you can see, that sort of show, aspects of the submarine. Like this is the control room. And the audience is all the way around. So they're standing in between these bits of set, and the actors could sort of like walk through the audience and push people aside, if they had to go to another area of the boat. So it was a very sort of like kinetic and exciting environment. And when we tried this out, so we tried out some of these ideas quite early on, before we sort of went into production. Whenever we lit it with theater lights, so with spotlights, it felt sort of fake. It didn't feel real. It felt quite artificial and theatrical. And that was the last thing we wanted. We wanted this to feel like a real submarine. So we started so we went to have a look at a submarine, and we found out that the inside of the submarine is lit with really simple lighting, so like fluorescent tubes and little spotlights from IKEA, that you might have on your desk. So we thought, well, we're just going to use the same lights than they have on the boats. So you can see on here, then we had some lights just attached, like these little sort of spotlights attached to some sort of cable trays, and some sort of fluorescent tubes. And there's another spotlight here, and that worked brilliantly. So the whole boat was lit with these little light instruments. We could control them, and that's so the semantics of that light, meant that it created a very powerful story of being on this submarine. So that was the semantics of the language. And then we had all this control from a lighting desk, so we could change. So one light could come on, and that would tell the audience, everybody look over there. And then we would have all the lights come on, and then we would just light the corridors if the sailors had to move to a different space. So we could use syntax by having a series of cues, and that helped the audience understand the language. Where do you want me to look? What's going to happen next? That's Kursk. Another show that's just lit with architectural lights, Krab's Last Tape. So the set was like a kind of shipping container. And I don't know whether the play is played by Samuel Beckett. It's just a one-man play. So it's like a single man listening to memories that he's recorded onto a tape machine. And in this case, this container was in the middle of the stage, and the audience sat in seats all the way around it. And the container was on a revolve, so it turned very, very slowly throughout the performance. You got different perspectives of the container. And we lit it just with things like this bulkhead, and inside was a sort of a fluorescent tube that lit the space and some angle pulses. And so the same idea, we decided to not use theater lights because we needed this container to feel authentic and real. So for the audience to understand the language of the light and to understand where the light comes from. So it's not so often in theater the lighting is like magic, isn't it? Because all you see is the frame of the opening of the proscenium arch, and there is a series of images there, but you don't know how it's lit. You don't see the lights. So what was really important here was that the audience was empowered and understood where the light came from and how the light is made, so they could see. So Krab switches on and off the lights. So the syntax of this language, other than in Kursk, where the lighting was controlled from a lighting desk, from a computer, So, so we could decide, what we wanted to do at what point. In Krab, the actor controls the light. So he decides when he wants to switch a light on or off. And that was really, really important because again, in this play or in this production, it was absolutely crucial that the audience would see and hear everything through the character of Krab. And the audience had to understand that. We had to tell them that, you need to listen and look really carefully, and you need to try and put yourself into the body of Krab. Otherwise, the play doesn't make any sense. And we did that by establishing a language of light that helped the audience understand that, because they saw Krab doing things and they saw a response, and they understood quite quickly that Krab was in control of the lighting, and therefore they trusted into everything he did or said. So that's, my example. This is like the Friedrich painting earlier. We wanted to channel everything through a single person, and the audience to not be distracted by lights changing without them knowing why does the light change, which often happens. So that idea as well of meaning is really important, of choices. Another example. So this is a play called Workshop, again, just lit with architectural light fittings. Similar reason, set in a workshop in Harare in Zimbabwe, and again, using those kind of, that in this production we didn't want this to be a pretense. We didn't want people to look at this like, oh, because the topic of the play is quite uncomfortable. It talks about sort of English or British colonialism, and the sort of the struggle of Zimbabwe to become independent, and to sort of like not have this, and Britain's guilt really with regards to what colonialism has done to Zimbabwe and obviously many other countries. So what was really important with what the director and us creative team wanted with this play was that it was quite uncomfortable for the audience. So we didn't want the audience to just be able to lean back and go, oh, this is really terrible, but this is a far away in a country that I've never been to. It doesn't mean anything to me. And we didn't want that. We wanted the audience to be uncomfortable in the presence of the play and the actors, and to feel the sort of power of it. And so we used these kind of really bright floodlights, like in a workshop, and they're quite hot. So we used the temp, so it would get really hot in the theater. It's quite a small theater, and because we had these big bright lights, it became quite hot. So we also used those kind of aspects of the lighting that it helped creating quite an uncomfortable atmosphere. And usually in theater, and in architecture too, we really try and avoid something called glare. So the glare of the light source. Usually we're trying to not have the glare in the field of vision. But in this play, we consciously wanted the glare of the light, because we wanted the audience to blink and to feel sort of, under attack from the lighting, and wanted them to shift in their seats. So again, a language developed in that play that used the light to, to sort of have these particular effects and meanings with the relationship to the audience. Okay. And so finally, but I'll talk a little bit more about this. This is a dance show called On the High Road, and done by a really brilliant company called the Clot Ensemble, who is a dance company based in London. And this is this is a show that's lit with theatre lights. So I wanted to show you at least one thing that's lit with theatre lights. And it's a really interesting show. I'll show you a bit of a film clip in a moment, so you get a sense of the show. It's, as you can see, it's well, anyway, I'll show you those images and the clip, and then we'll talk about it. So here's an image. Another one, as you can see, the set is just this sort of vertical house shape. And the whole piece it's based on a short story by Tolstoy. And it's about a people who are sort of holed up in an inn in the middle of nowhere, and there's a big storm outside, so they're all inside. They can't get out. They're all sort of holed up in this small house, and the piece is about how people respond to that. You know, like if their liberty is being hemmed in, and they can't get out, and we felt there were a lot of sort of contemporary resonances with regards to things like the refugees, this sort of idea of the world changing, and in this in the Tolstoy story there is a group of refugees who arrive at the inn, and it's about how do people inside, do they let them in or not, and how do they sort of relate to them. So there's a lot of really contemporary references, and this was all, sort of like obviously all sort of communicated through dance and through movement. Some other pictures, and the whole piece was lit with 6 lights, and these were moving automated lights. So the ones that you see on rock and roll shows, or that can move. So the beam can move if you want to, but the light itself can move. And it gives you a lot of control over the light. So the optics can change. So you can have a wide beam or a narrow beam. You can have, you can crop the image as in, in that. So we used just 6 lights, but they could do a lot. They could move around, quite filmic, like the camera can move. These lights can sort of, you can decide, like a film editor, you can decide, what bit you want to reveal and how. By repositioning those lights during the show from a computer. So questions in a sec. I'm just going to move over to the film now. So bear with me, and then I'll show you that. Okay, one sec. I'm going to share again. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the beginning of On the High Road. So it'd be about 5 minutes. And I think when we tried it earlier, the sound might be slightly out of sync, but you'll get the idea. So here we go.
There's no doubt how the mountains stood beneath the rafters. They echoed and laughed, raised a glass to the hereafter. Falling down the stair, pulling up a chair, wine and whiskey drinking, like politicians thinking how to raise the funds with sing. Come to the street, Jesus, lost right there. We'll not kill ourselves for fear of death. Sighing as always stood, live by the air that singing brings. There is no winter to summer love, the delights of the wild, none like wine. The street lights, yes, I'm already all far away, and home in the sea, and gets into your blood. It calls, you must obey. wisdom, pulling up a chair, wine and whiskey drinking, like politicians thinking how to raise the funds when sinking. Come to drink, if it's a quantum, it's what I think. We'll not kill ourselves for fear of death. Sighing is a waste of breath. Let by the air that singing brings through the winter to the spring.
So, and I'm gonna move us forward for a sec. But so this is the beginning of Under High Road, and as you can see, so in terms of the language of the light, the main thing really is just to establish what's happening, and the main thing that's happening is that there's a big storm. So in that respect, the language of light is really straightforward. It's just establishing a frame for that story. And so to the choices, the strobe lighting, very simply, it just came from the idea of we wanted there to be flashes of lightning. But it was not just that. We also wanted it to be quite visceral, quite immersive, like we talked about earlier, this idea that the storm is all around us, it's not just on stage. So we had strobes in the auditorium. So it was flickering all around the audience, not just on stage. And then we use these moving lights to pick out people, like mostly the singer at the beginning. But we also, I don't know how much you can see in the film, but they're moved, so a bit like searchlights, because we also wanted it to feel a little bit like maybe a war zone or a place that's in crisis. So we had these light beams moving around and picking out people. To give this idea of maybe a searchlight or similar. Okay, so just going to move, and then just a few more minutes a bit further, and so it's just 9 minutes into the piece. Hopefully it'll work. Going to skip us on a little bit, but these first 10 minutes after the storm are just lit in that with a single light from the front, as you can see here. And the reason why we decided that was, so I, as lighting designer, I knew quite early on that it would be a white set and that the costumes would be black, and it would be a lot about shapes, like the shapes of the hats and the shapes that the bodies would make through the choreography. So and we wanted this to feel a bit like a black and white film, like like cutouts in front of a white screen. So to do that, I, as a lighting designer, I know that if I light this directly from the front, bit like lighting it for photography, there won't be any shadows. You will see that very direct black on white. So so sometimes lighting decisions are really easy because you just think, well, what do I need to do to achieve a particular effect? So it's not, you don't always have to think about language and about meaning. Sometimes it's like in that example, well, we just want it to look like a 2D, black and white shape. Okay, fine, just light it from the front and that's it. Okay, so moving on a bit. Okay, so so I showed you that bit because it's, so as you could see, it's the light's changing, and the light, so there's syntax now, so we move through a series of cues, and on a very, on a surface level, all that's happening in the story is that they go to sleep. Everybody, it's the end of the day. The three women that you could, that you can see that at the end, those are the three pilgrims, the outsiders who've, and this whole first piece of choreography is about them finding a way to fit in, and then the move into nighttime. It's, and also the other big thing with in my work, but also with the Clotte ensemble particularly, is the synchronicity of the music. So so the music and the light are connected really closely. So so the crack of thunder and the flash of the lightning need to be synchronized really closely for it to work as an effect. But with regards to the language, what's happening is that we move out of this very so single source lighting from the front into a more complex picture. So where we've just stopped, the singer is lit, who we've seen at the beginning, who's the sort of narrator figure. So we say to the audience, okay, look at her, because the next bit is going to be about her. And then we light the three pilgrims that start in this sort of very gentle movement. And that's now lit from the sides. So it's not lit from the front anymore, but from the sides. And what side lighting does is it accentuates shape and bodies. You'll notice, like lighting a piece of sculpture or something. So it's, so, and what that means of shifting from the front light to the side light means that what I'm saying to the audience is, so you don't need to worry about what happens in people's faces anymore. You need to look at the shape of the body, because the dancers will now communicate not as a group but purely through the shapes they're presenting, and that's what I'm going to light. So that's why I'm shifting the angle. So in terms of semantics, that's then how you can tell the audience how to understand and relate to a particular piece. That's it. So thank you. I don't know how much of this you were able to. Ich gehe jetzt zurück aufs Deutsche. Also habt ihr irgendwelche Fragen?
Als erstes müssen wir uns herzlich bedanken. Und hier brandet rauschender Beifall auf, natürlich, den wir uns mal wieder denken müssen. Vielen Dank.
Dankeschön. Ja, kein Problem. Ja, also falls ihr irgendwelche Fragen habt über den Vortrag oder mehr generell, also ich glaube, wir haben 8 Minuten. Also ich kann, dann beantworte ich die gern.
Wir haben hier auch, wir haben keinen Timeslot bezahlt. Wir werden nicht rausgeschmissen. Wir dürfen diskutieren, bis uns keine Fragen mehr einfallen. Wer hat eine Frage? Frau Weißner.
Ja, ich wollte eigentlich bei dem ersten Stück, was du gezeigt hast, fragen, wie das da mit der Blendung war, wo alle quasi rundum, also das Publikum quasi im U-Boot sein sollten. Und dann wurde es quasi ein paar Folien später ja beantwortet bei dem anderen Stück, also dass du das quasi auch gezielt einsetzt, aber genau, auch gerne nochmal zu dem ersten, wie das da war, weil da wird ja sicher das ein oder andere auch mal geblendet haben.
Nee, das ist eine gute Frage, weil in Kursk, in dem ersten Stück, war die Blendung, es gab 2 Arten von Beleuchtung oder von Language in Kursk. Das eine war, also in dem Stück gab es 2 verschiedene Arten von Action. Ich gehe jetzt wieder auf Englisch zurück. So in Kursk there were 2 types of action. The play was devised. So Briony Lavery, the writer, wrote the play during rehearsals. So that's quite unusual. So we would try out things in the rehearsal room, and then and then Brownie would go away and write a scene and then come back the next day and we would then sort of work on it again. And what we found quite early was there were two types of action on the boat or in Kursk, in the play. One was when it was about everybody, so about the sailors as a group. So, and we found, so, and often so there might be a scene where all the sailors would do something. So they might go through a fire drill on board the submarine, or they might dive the boat, so everybody had something to do. And in those kind of scenes, the blendung that Lena mentioned, it didn't matter. Because the dramaturgy of the lighting, or the language of the light, was about the whole boat. So everything is alive. Everything is there's action everywhere. And then the other type of scene that Brownie wrote were sort of like internal monologues. So there were moments in the play where we found out a little bit more about the sailors. So there was one scene where the coxswain, who is the second in command of the boat, he had so we could hear his thoughts, and he would think about his family at home. And in those moments we decided to light it very carefully. So blendung was we managed very carefully in those moments. So, and which is why we had the spotlights, because the spotlights you can control the beam, it's quite a narrow beam, and the fluorescence you can't. So in the moments of action, we used the fluorescence, and things where blendung was not, we didn't have to worry about it. And when there were individual sailors doing something, or we wanted the audience just to look at one thing and not at everything, we used the little spotlights, so we could control the light. So in Kursk, Lena, yeah, absolutely, we had to think really carefully about. And the reason why it's really important, blendung in theatre, is because and if you've worked in theatre, you'll notice that if you light, if an audience looks at a stage, they will always look at the brightest thing. Whatever you do, so whatever is the brightest thing in the frame they're looking at, they'll look at that. And there can be an actor doing something really, really important, like 2 meters to the side. If they're not lit as brightly as the chair, then the audience will not listen to the actor. So which is why directors in theatre are often really frightened of lighting, because they worry that if the light isn't right, it will destroy everything they've done, for 4 weeks in the rehearsal room. So theatre lighting is really delicate, and so yeah, so you have to be really careful that you manage the blendung so it's dramaturgically right. So yeah, so good question.
Danke. Ja, aber also von meinem Gefühl her scheiden sich da ein bisschen die Geister. Also dass Leute auch im Theaterbereich, die sagen, so Blendung ist so nach dem Motto, geht gar nicht, darf nicht passieren. Oder auch also vom Publikum aus, so das stört mich, das will ich nicht haben sozusagen. Und dann sagen, ja, das ist aber genau ein Mittel, was ich einsetzen möchte.
Ja. Das ist
spannend.
Ja, nee, ist ja auch beides okay, solange es gewollt ist.
Ja.
Okay. Aber wenn es nicht gewollt ist, wenn es einfach nur nicht ordentlich gemacht worden ist oder weil niemand drüber gedacht hat, dann ist es nicht okay.
Danke.
Bitteschön.
Wenn die Fragen gerade noch nicht so drängend, dann schieße ich mal los mit meinen. Wie verzahnt wird sowas denn entwickelt? Das kam jetzt auch in den Fragen von Lena Weisner heraus. Das muss schon in enger Abstimmung erfolgen. Und bei deinem letzten Beispiel haben wir das ja auch, das war ja offensichtlich, dass dieses Scherenschnitthafte, da muss eben Licht und Kulisse, Kostüm, das muss alles ineinander gehen. Wie weit kann man denn da überhaupt zusammenarbeiten und wie weit kriegt man was vorgesetzt und so, jetzt macht das Licht dazu?
Ja, kommt zum Teil drauf an, mit wem man arbeitet und wo man arbeitet. Also Also im kommerziellen Theater, also im West End oder so, ist es meistens so, dass das Licht relativ spät kommt. Also und da ist dann das Licht eher nur dekorativ. Ne? Soll halt gut aussehen. Und so gesehen, das kann man auch noch relativ spät machen. Ne? Man beleuchtet halt, was man antrifft, ne? Die Bühne oder die Choreografie oder je nachdem. Mit sowas wie mit dem Clot-Ensemble, mit dem Tanzstück, da ist es natürlich, also ich sehe, da ist manchmal sogar das Licht, die Beleuchtung. Also eben mit dem Clot-Ensemble machen wir es, wenn es normalerweise geht, so, dass wir die Beleuchtung in den Proben haben, was relativ selten möglich ist. Also normalerweise ist im Probenraum, gibt es keine Theaterbeleuchtung. Wird halt geprobt unter normalen Raumlicht. Aber mit dem Clot-Ensemble, also da vor allem jetzt die letzten paar Stücke, also das On the High Road, hatten wir die Beleuchtung vom ersten Tag im Probenraum. Und deswegen, zum Teil deswegen haben wir nur sechs Scheinwerfer, weil wir uns sonst das hätten nicht leisten können. Also geht es dann auch ums Budget und wie viel Geld man hat. Ne? Also weil man dann die Beleuchtungskörper, wenn man die für 6 Wochen haben will, also für 4 Wochen Proben und dann die ersten 2 Wochen im Theater, muss man die ja dann erstmal bezahlen können. Wenn man im Theater ist, dann sind sie natürlich da, aber die Proben sind ja normalerweise nicht auf der Bühne, die sind ja in einem Probenraum. Und dann muss man natürlich dann dementsprechend das Geld haben, um die um die eventuell dann einfach einzukaufen oder zu mieten. Und deswegen zum Teil haben wir dann nur 6 Scheinwerfer für das Clot-Ensemble, weil das konnten wir uns leisten. Aber was natürlich dann das Tolle dran ist, dass oft die Susie Wilson, die Regisseurin, ich kann da was zeigen nur mit Licht und sie kriegt dann davon eine Idee für die Bewegung, für die Choreografie. Und das ist natürlich klasse. Und das ist relativ selten, dass das passiert, dass man so arbeiten kann. Ne? Dass also dass das alles zusammen passiert und dass der Ton auch schon da ist, dass man also die Musik und den Ton dann schon dabei hat. Aber also es gibt beides. Aber es geht vor allem, es kommt um, wie viel Geld man hat, mit wem man arbeitet und so weiter.
Ich kann auch, wen das interessiert, dazu was aus der tatsächlich deutschen Theaterszene sagen, freie Szene und auch Stadttheater. Da ist es tatsächlich so, die Stadttheaterstrukturen sind total starr. Da hast du halt deine Beleuchtungsprobe, die läuft im Zweifelsfall wie die Bauprobe noch 4 Wochen, bevor überhaupt tatsächlich die ganze Kiste anfängt wirklich zu proben. Das wird dann im Vorfeld alles festgelegt. Freies Theater, alle Gruppen, mit denen ich zu tun hatte, da startest du bei einem normalen Produktionszeitraum von 6 Wochen, 6 bis 8 Wochen. Ab der 4., 5. Woche geht es los, auf jeden Fall mit Licht auch. Weil einfach da ja bis zum Ende auch angepasst wird und nicht alles feststeht. Da wird ja fast alles immer noch während der Probenzeit überhaupt entwickelt. Und dann bis in den letzten 2, 3 Wochen befeuerst du dich immer gegenseitig und befruchtest dich gegenseitig mit den Lichtgeschichten und dann reagieren die darauf und dann entwickelst du zusammen und so. Wenn du die Möglichkeit hast, halt auch einen Raum zu haben, wo du schon Licht einrichten kannst und du hast Beleuchtungsmittel natürlich, das ist die andere Sache, was du auch gesagt hast. Wobei sich da tatsächlich im deutschen freien Theater in den meisten auch schon ganz gute Technikpools finden und die sich auch ganz gut sonst untereinander unterstützen.
Ja, nee, und da hast du recht. Ich meine, das ist auch natürlich mit Beleuchtung im Theater, also eine der Schwierigkeiten ist ja, dass der Bühnengestalter, der kann ja ein schönes Modell machen von der Bühne und da kann man genau sehen, wie das aussieht und da kann Zeichnungen machen von den Kostümen, super. Und der Komponist oder so, der kann die Musik schreiben und die kann man ja auch schon hören. Aber das mit der Beleuchtung, was gerade Fabian beschrieben hat, im Normalfall, die Beleuchtung sieht man ja erst ein paar Tage vor der Premiere zum ersten Mal. Na? Und alle anderen Abteilungen haben schon für Wochen und Wochen, die waren im Probenraum, wissen schon genau, was die Schauspieler machen und wie die Bühne aussehen wird und die Kostüme. Aber das Licht weiß man, und deswegen ist auch ziemlich stressvoll, der Job als Lighting Designer, weil man dann wirklich erst mit ein paar Tage vor Premiere sieht man zum ersten Mal, wie das Licht eventuell aussehen wird auf der technischen Probe, wenn man dann endlich im Theater drin ist. Und deswegen oft ist dann die Beleuchtung natürlich auch nicht so elegant oder so kompliziert, wie man es eventuell gerne haben möchte, weil man einfach nicht die Zeit hat, ne? Weil man einfach nur das dann unheimlich schnell in ein paar Tagen machen muss. Und dann ist, also das ist auch was natürlich schon ein wichtiger Punkt ist. Ja,
ja, das, und du hast dann oft in den Stadttheatern zumindest oft ja auch noch wirklich solche Strukturen, die einfach ein schnelles, flexibles Arbeiten gar nicht ermöglichen. Also da, wenn nicht der Oberbeleuchter sagt, jetzt Lampe 3, dann drückt keiner einen Knopf. So, und während der Show macht er das erst, wenn irgendwie die Inspizient sagt, jetzt drückt den Knopf. Also das ist halt wirklich, im Stadttheater leuchten ist, also mir macht es ehrlich gesagt nicht Spaß.
ja.
Also,
Nee. Deswegen arbeite ich weiterhin in England.
ja. Gut.
Und gibt es da eine Tendenz? Also ich hatte jetzt auch schon mal gehört, dass es eher so ist, noch kompakter, noch mehr komprimiert. Also dass die Beleuchtungszeit noch mehr verkürzt wird, so insgesamt der Trend. Könnt ihr das bestätigen, oder?
Ja, nee, also es ist nicht unbedingt. Also jetzt der Rufus Norris, der jetzt der künstlerische Leiter vom National Theatre ist in London oder ist schon seit ein paar Jahren, der stemmt sich eher gegen den Trend. Also der gibt mehr Zeit für Beleuchtung. Also es ist also so gesehen, also jetzt wenn man jetzt, es gibt natürlich jetzt diese ganzen Visualization-Programme, also so Visivik, ich weiß nicht, ob ihr das kennt, wo man also auch dann, oder wie in Vectorworks oder so, wo man dann natürlich schon die Beleuchtung schon auf dem Computer machen kann. Und also für gerade wieder so Projekte, wo dann wie Rock'n'Roll-Shows oder so, ja, da wird die Beleuchtung auf dem Computer gemacht und dann innerhalb von ein paar Stunden geht es in die Halle rein und das sieht dann schon fast genauso aus wie auf dem Computer. Also da geht es schon schneller. Aber mit Theaterbeleuchtung, wo es eher noch um so das feine Detail geht, also wo es zwischen 20% oder 30% Intensität relativ großer Unterschied ist, das schaffen die Visualization-Programme natürlich noch nicht. Also so gesehen, also nö, also es gibt, je nachdem, wo man hingeht, aber in den so Staatstheatern in England auf jeden Fall geben sie gerade wieder eher mehr Zeit für Beleuchtung.
Ja, schön.
Wie erreicht man das denn, dass Musik und Licht dann so exakt auf den Punkt gleichzeitig sind?
Ja,
Alles programmiert oder schnelle Finger?
nee, alles programmiert. Also es ist ein MIDI-Control-Signal und also die Cue-Points sind in dem Music-Track reingebaut. Also die Rock'n'Roll-Shows machen das Gleiche. Oder mit den Rock'n'Roll-Shows ist es ein halbes übers Instrument, ne? Also dass dann der Drumkit oder die Gitarre so Cues oder Trigger-Points zur Beleuchtung schickt. Und jetzt in dem Clot-Ensemble, ja, die sind also alle dann in den Music-Track reingebaut, die Cue-Points. Und ja, es geht alles über den Computer. Der Finger wäre nicht schnell genug. Und es ist ja auch oft noch der Finger, man muss das dann auch, wie gesagt, der Inspizient oder der Stage Manager sagt dann ja, Lighting Cue 5, go. Und dann muss einer draufdrücken. Und also so, wenn es dann um Bruchteile von Sekunden geht nur über Computer. Also das ja, wird also alles jetzt über Computer gesteuert.
Und Bewegungsverfolgung dann auch wirklich technisch gelöst oder dann schon auch nochmal, also da staune ich dann wirklich auch, wie so ein Ballett, stehen die jeden Abend exakt an der gleichen Stelle?
Ja, meistens schon. Also Tänzer sind unglaublich gut mit genau den richtigen Punkt zu finden auf der Bühne. Also es gibt schon jetzt auch Technologie, wo die Scheinwerfer so Thermal Imagery benutzen, um Körper zu verfolgen auf der Bühne. Also das wird in so große Rock'n'Roll-Shows oder Dancing on Ice oder sowas, so Eisshows, die benutzen das. Also statt dem Verfolger, statt dem Follow-Spot, können sie das jetzt alles schon direkt über den Computer machen. Aber mit dem Plot-Ensemble, nee, also da verlässt man sich schon noch auf den Tänzer, dass die den genau richtigen Punkt trifft. Und das schaffen sie auch. Schauspieler eher nicht. Aber Tänzer, die sind immer total genau auf dem richtigen Punkt.
Bei dem Bühnenbild speziell hat natürlich auch der Absturz gedroht, wenn man die Stelle nicht trifft.
Okay, gut. Nö, aber also wenn es keine Fragen mehr gibt, dann tue ich jetzt meine Kinder ins Bett.
Meines tobt ja auch gerade durch die Wohnung. Ja, das hat mich gerade ein wenig abgelenkt, leider. Ja.
Prima. Also vielen Dank. Vielen Dank zum Zuhören. Und Cornelia, vielen Dank für die Gastfreundschaft.
Danke dir fürs Kommen, für den schönen Vortrag. Ich möchte ins Theater, so schnell wie es geht.
Ja, und wie gesagt, ich meine, die Cornelia hat auch meine E-Mail. Also wenn irgendjemand von euch irgendwas interessiert ist oder nochmal nachfragen will, dann fragt einfach die Cornelia und die kann euch meine E-Mail geben und ich freue mich auch, wenn ihr irgendwas wissen wollt, sagt einfach nochmal Bescheid. Ne?
Und um den Werbeblock noch zu Ende zu bringen, Lena Weißner war schon in London am Rose Bruford College und kann genau berichten, was für Erfahrungen man dort machen kann. Und mein Eindruck ist, sie war sehr begeistert, sonst hätte sie den Kontakt nicht vermittelt zu Hansjörg Schmidt. Wo ich mich nochmal wirklich auch an der Stelle bedanken möchte, Frau Weißner.
Ja,
vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank, Lena. Ja,
und wir kriegen da auch noch jemand anderen hin, wenn es da Interesse gibt.
Wir freuen uns auf jeden Fall. Okay, also gut, macht's gut. Tschüss.
Vielen Dank, Hansjörg.
Ciao.